Father Henry was raised in a household where eminent literary and artistic figures were regularly visitors. So guests might include Father Ronald Knox, a brilliant Oxford scholar who translated the Bible. It equally may have been General Lord Ismay, Churchill's chief military advisor in World War II. So there was a constant stream of well-known figures at the dinner table where he was growing up in his family home. There would be recitals in the evening by international musicians. On the walls were family portraits by John Sargent and others. So you can imagine the home where Father Henry grows up. Just wonderful. He goes to Ampleforth, and obviously for school. He then later becomes a monk there, starts learning Latin at the age of 10, and by the age of 14 he's already read the Acts of the Apostles in Greek. So you can see the background of the classical, the languages there, and how that classical background then enables this transition into biblical studies. In terms of Hebrew, a friend gifts him a Bible in Hebrew, and that kind of starts that fascination. He then goes to Switzerland, teams up with another student, as you obviously do, to arrange lessons from a local rabbi. So there's clearly that language development that's constant. Obviously the years at Oxford, he did several degrees there. He was examined by C.S. Lewis, figures that I would just love to meet. And then he's invited to update, do a new translation of the New Jerusalem Bible. And of course, this is also in the years around Vatican II. I'm a Russian speaker, so I have an interest in languages myself, and just knowing how this development has happened is just thrilling to understand. And he works then tirelessly and pretty much on his own for 7 years on this new translation of the Jerusalem Bible, translating again from the original languages. In 1991, he becomes member of the Pontifical Biblical Commission and is on that for 10 years. The chair, of course, is Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, and he is part of producing some very important works. At the request of Pope John Paul II, the Jewish people and its Holy Scripture in the Christian Bible, and then the second is the Bible and morality. And one thing that I'm particularly grateful for is that in the kind of an advance in the Catholic biblical scholarship in the past, say, 60 years, Father Henry is very keen to encourage Protestant biblical scholars to have some contribution as well, saying that actually we can learn from one another. So I'm particularly thankful for that. And just, yes, there's lots to share with Father Henry, but thank you, and you will also, I think many of you know Father Henry, so and we will also know many of the different works that he has written. I love the one he's done on the Psalms. Thank you for that. So please, a big round of applause for Father Henry.
I wanted to call this Fire to the Earth, and fire is dangerous. The Bible is dangerous, and it's because it is fire to the earth. And this is so, in one way, in translation, the Bible has brought fire to the earth in several ways. It's been a light showing the way, which we believe to be not only light to the church and light to the Christians in the world, but to understanding the basic truths of life. It also brings fire in the sense of energy and impetus to God's word, an inspiration which galvanizes its readers in our search for truth. And I'm talking, of course, not merely about Roman Catholics, but all Catholics. Catholics in the sense of universal, all members of the universal church. I'm delighted to see that there is someone from the Eastern Church too. And not only Christians, but Jews also keep to the Bible, and even Muslims. And so many Muslim ideas are drawn eventually from the Bible. I want to consider some moments when there's a fire of disagreement, and especially when its translation has been so. So much of my consideration of the Bible has concerned translation in my life. And I want to consider 4 situations where this has been the fire of danger to the earth, to his translators, namely St. Jerome, John Wycliffe, William Tyndale, and as a little codicil for myself. So there's a bit of crescendo and then downgrade at the end. So it's first question, Greek or Hebrew? Is the Bible Greek or Hebrew? The first question is, which is the Bible? For the Jews it remains what Christians call the Old Testament. But in what language? In the late 2nd century before Christ, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, called the Septuaginta. The name, which is the Latin and also the Greek Latin, for 70, comes from the story told in the letter of Aristeas that 70 Jewish scholars were commissioned by King Ptolemy II of Egypt to translate the Old Testament for the Greek-speaking Jews of Alexandria. So, listen what happened next. 70 Jewish scholars were commissioned, starting at the same moment, each in separate rooms, 70 different rooms, and after 70 days, each of the 70 emerged with an identical translation. You can believe that if you like. 7, of course, is the perfect number, multiplied by 10, and it's especially sturdy and immobile. Historically, this story has only a slight historical basis or claim. It claims only that God guided the translation. It was inspired, and a linguistic study shows that the Septuagint does indeed stem from the 2nd century in Alexandria. There's a series of minor differences from the Hebrew Masoretic text, accepted by most Jews as the authentic text, and various texts of the Septuaginta. The major distinction, of course, is that some of the books, including the 2 books of Maccabees, were originally written in Greek and have no Hebrew text. They're known as the Apocrypha, the hidden books. They're given various degrees of weight by different Christian communities, and St. Jerome translated the Bible from the Greek Septuagint, and afterwards from the Masoretic text, from the Hebrew itself. I've translated it twice, but both times from the combination of the 2. It was Jerome's earlier version, translated into Latin from the Septuagint, that the Roman Church chose to canonize, and this remained the authorized text, unchallenged till the Reformation. But Luther, when for theological reasons he chose the later option of Jerome of sticking to the Hebrew, he chose that for theological reasons. And this enabled him to exclude from the inspired text the custom of prayer for the dead, which comes only in the 2nd book of Maccabees, one of the Greek books. The important point was that for the reason of excluding prayer for the dead, and so the payment of money for such masses, that Luther excluded the Greek books. I am, in fact, firmly convinced that many of Luther's early reforms were motivated not by the laudable determination to exclude the medieval trade, were motivated by the laudable determination to exclude the medieval trade in masses for the dead. If anyone's looking for a doctoral thesis, I think a fruitful topic might be that the chief reason for Luther's Reformation was financial abuse in the church. Not any doctrinal difference, but the financial abuse was the most important moving matter in Luther's change. The difference between the Greek and Hebrew brings me to a delightful subject of the Bible as fire to the earth within the church, a squabble between St. Augustine and Jerome, and this was conducted by letter between Hippo and Bethlehem, Augustine in Hippo and Jerome in Bethlehem. Each writes with extreme difference, but firm difference. Augustine with the firmness of assumed humility, pretended humility, and Jerome with all his barbed and pugnacious wit. So Jerome was a tricky character to deal with, and Augustine shows considerable caution. We need to retreat a little to Jerome's first steps in biblical translation. Pope Damasus had found that there were as many versions of translations into Latin as there were fragments of the Old and New Testament. And in the early 380s, so late 4th century, Pope Damasus summoned Jerome from Dalmatia to harmonize the four Gospels out of these scattered fragments, the Vetus Latina, translated from the Greek into Latin rather casually, just by chance, all kinds of different texts. And Jerome at one time said there were as many different texts of the Vetus Latina as there were pieces of paper in the Bible. Jerome claimed to have worked closely with Damasus and his secretary for 3 years, edited at least the Gospels, possibly more, but only the New Testament, and he was very pleased with himself. He wrote to a friend saying that it was rumoured that he, Jerome, was going to be elected Pope when Damasus died. Damasus was getting old, and Jerome was certain to be elected Pope. It didn't happen. When Damasus died, Jerome was expelled from Rome by what he calls Senatus Illi Pharisaeorum, that Senate of Pharisees, the Roman Council of Priests, which disapproved of Jerome's relationship with certain young ladies. He started as their spiritual director. Indeed, some of his letters to them are decidedly warm. I might almost say hot, but not quite what should be written by a spiritual director to a young lady. Anyway, he was expelled from Rome and decamped to Bethlehem with his young ladies and remained there for the rest of his life. It was from there that he did his 2 major translations, first from the Septuagint. The wrangling's gone on ever since, fierce instant of fire on earth. So this first version became the accepted basic text, translated from the Septuagint, the Greek. If I need to decide which of these translations is the more authentic, I personally would say this first one, translated from the Greek, the language of the Eastern Church. But then, Jerome, possibly under the influence of the Jewish rabbis who coached him in Aramaic, or more probably because he wanted to make controversy with the Jews, he started translating from the Hebrew so that he could use the same Bible as the people with whom he was in controversy. And he was fiercely attacked for this translation from the Hebrew and equally fiercely defended. He spoke of howling dogs who raged savagely against him, hissing snakes, shrieks of disapproval. He was not afraid to use extreme language about anyone who opposed him. Anyway, one consequence of this decision was that it became an important point of church disunity, leaving the field open to Luther, who followed Jerome 1,000 years later. But a more immediate clash is reported by Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, a small instance of fire on the earth. Augustine writes to Jerome, raising the question about Christian unity. Which is the authentic text? Is it the Greek or the Hebrew? Jerome had translated into Latin first from the Greek and then changed his mind. In the former version, Jerome had carefully marked the differences between the Greek and the Hebrew. But in the later version, from the Hebrew, he didn't put such marks at all. Not only this confuses people, says Augustine, but further, it'll widen the breach between the Greek-speaking churches of the East and the Latin churches of the West. And he writes, detailing the furore raised by the reading in Tripoli in North Africa, when Jerome's translation from the Hebrew was read out at the Eucharist. Which translation should it be? You see, I took this photograph about 60 years ago. That's Nineveh. In the background you can see the Euphrates. Nineveh is an ancient city in Assyria, and it's just on the Euphrates, which you can see flowing down. What you can see is a ziggurat. And there is a reconstruction by Henry Layard, who excavated Nineveh, of what it was like. That in the middle is a ziggurat, which is the temple of the Ninevites. Well, Nineveh was a wicked city, and Jonah was sent to convert them and tell them they must change their ways. And they changed their ways so much so that even the animals fasted and didn't eat or drink at all. Meanwhile, Jonah sat on the top of a hill opposite Nineveh, waiting for it to be the city to be destroyed. And God made a plant grow up to give him a shade. And Jonah was rather upset when God next day withered the plant. Now, what was the plant that grew up in a few hours? The Greek has chiton, which was formerly translated gourd. But gourds grow along the ground. They have to, because they're so heavy with water. And they don't provide any shade at all. So Jerome was a bit worried, and relying on the Hebrew word pikeam, translated it ivy. The Greek for ivy is chiton, which is near enough to the Hebrew word. And that gives hardly any shade, but anyway. When ivy was read out at Tripoli instead of gourd, there was a riot. And the presiding bishop didn't know any Hebrew, so he couldn't turn to the local Jews for a decision. And the local Jews, so he had to turn to the local Jews for a decision on the Hebrew. And the local Jews said Jerome was wrong. And Augustine relayed this to Jerome, to be met by a storm of correction. The local Jews are malicious or ignorant, he said. And would Augustine please stop tormenting an old man who was 9 years older than Augustine, not much more older. And why would Augustine stop forcing him to go to war again and risk his life? Jerome had no doubt about his own skills and wasn't going to accept any blame for the riot. But there was a great deal of your reverence and my most charming brother, worthy of all respect, on both sides in their letters. But the fact is that Jerome's reply shows that he was clearly hopping mad about the change of words and this insinuation that he didn't know what he was talking about. Next we come to John Wycliffe. And Wycliffe is someone very close to my heart. John Wycliffe, 1330 to 1384, closely associated with the peasants' revolt, as we'll see. There he is. John Wycliffe was a Yorkshireman. His village, the village from which he came, is now called Wycliffe for some reason, but his original pronunciation was a short vowel. So he's a Yorkshireman, sometime priest at Northallerton. He was in fact not the translator of the Bible himself, but he inspired two disciples, Nicholas Hereford and John Purvey, to set about the first translations of the Bible in more or less modern English. They were popular, and there are over 200 copies, contemporary copies, remain. There was dire need for an English translation. There,
and this is Bede's era. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels, beautifully decorated. Several different colours used. And look at all those birds' heads. Bird's head, well, is the head of the bee, is that a bird or is it a dog?
It's not me talking.
It could be a dog or a hound or a wolf or something. Look at the word is plural, so the second letter, L, has a head like that.
I have no idea what that is. So there was dire need for an English translation. What I show you there, is the first translation into more or less English. You see the big word in the middle is plures, black on red background. Just underneath the es is Godspell. That's the back please. Just underneath is Godspell, and there is this we don't really know. This manuscript is the Book of Kells, which was later found in Kells in Ireland, was possibly penned in Northumberland. But don't tell an Irishman that. And it was the first attempt in 900 writing the translation over the Latin words given there. So that's the first English translation in the Book of Kells, an Old English. But there was no translation at all of the more modern there. And there was dire need for it. In 1222, in the centuries before Wycliffe, the Council of Oxford required that priests should be able to, at least to understand the Latin formula of Eucharistic consecration, the consecration at the Eucharist in Latin. In the same year, a visitation of the Diocese of Salisbury showed that 5 out of 17 parish clergy were incapable of translating the words of consecration from Latin into English. And the reason is partly that the Vulgate was so expensive that few individuals could pay for it. Few individuals other than the higher clergy could have their own copy. That is a book of the Codex Amiatinus, which is one of the first books containing the whole of the New Testament. It was penned at Wearmouth and Shadow during Bede's time. But it's in Latin, not English. England was well behind other European countries in translating the Bible. England was notoriously backward in the development of printing. The first book to be printed in England by William Caxton came out in 1476. Gutenberg invented printing in 1440, 36 years earlier, when he unveiled the secret of movable type. The first French Bible appeared in 1476. By 1500, Germany had received printing of 15 different German Bibles, but nothing in English. And Wycliffe demanded that there should be a translation. He got mixed up with the Pleasant Revolt, and that harmed him. I'm going to skip a bit and go on faster. Wycliffe was pressing for two things: a redistribution of wealth and a translation of the Bible. And because he was pressing for the redistribution of wealth, he was taken up by the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, and this led to a condemnation of the Bible too, of the English Bible, which was associated with Wycliffe. He became known as the Morning Star of the Reformation for the double reason. The chief difficulty was his association with the statements about the assertion of the importance of poverty. He said, Christ, during the time of his pilgrimage here, was a most poor man who cast off all worldly dominion to the secular power and should effectually urge his clergy to do likewise. One of the reasons why I'm very attracted to Wycliffe is that he spoke so clearly and fiercely, but one result was that the translation of the Bible was banned. There were the two translations made by disciples of Wycliffe, and they were banned, so that there was no English translation available. The result of his becoming a figurehead of the Peasants' Revolt, together with his championship of the need for a return to the biblical theology and a need for the availability of a Bible accessible to all, was that the constitutions of Oxford in 1407 banned any translation of the Bible and made the possession of an English text illegal. It was not until 1428 that Wycliffe's bones were dug up and burnt, but special permission was required to possess an English language Bible. It was granted to the blue-stocking Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was a wonderful person, and was the mother of King Henry VII, of the Eight. And there follows an almost eerie silence in England about a translation of the Bible. Some said that English was not considered a literary language, and as a prose medium it was still characterized as rude and barbarous. Sir Thomas Eliot in 1531, in the preface to the book named Governor, complained of the difficulty made by the poverty of the language, of English language. Eliot invented in that book, his own book, a lot of English words like modesty, mediocrity, industrious, benefice. But the complaint has all the marks of a literary convention. Thus Thomas More, in his Apology in 1523, is arguing directly that there's no point in Englishing the Bible when he makes the estimate that people far fewer than 4 parts of the whole divided into 10, that is 40%, could never read English and now are too old to go to school. A quarter of a century later, so in 1570, 60 or 70, Bishop Stephen Gardiner of Winchester estimates that it's still more pessimistic when he writes, "No one in the 100th part of the realm could read." As late as 1605, only 60 of the books in the Bodleian Library were in English. The other 60,000 books in the Bodleian Library were all in Latin. So there was a strong feeling that there was no good translation of the Bible because no one could read it. So that was an unsuccessful attempt to get a Bible in English, which ended up in Wycliffe's bones being burnt. He himself had already died, but some 20 years after his death, his bones were burnt. So the next translator I want to look at is Tyndale. There's fire on earth, not merely in the burning of dead bones, but bloodshed itself. In 1523, a young man called William Tyndale offered himself to Bishop Tunstall of London as a translator. One shouldn't be surprised that he was bluntly told there was no room in the bishop's household. He was clearly offering himself as a translator of the Bible, and he offers Isocrates as his sample test. Isocrates is a very formal, sophisticated philosopher, and the offer was refused. I just want to quote what Tyndale said about making the Bible into English. Master Tyndale, according to Fox's Book of Martyrs, happened to be in the company of a certain divine, recounted for a learned man, and in communing and disputing with him, he drove him to the issue that the great doctor burst out with these blasphemous words, "We were better to be without God's laws than without the Pope's." "We were better to be without God's laws than the Pope's," said someone disputing with Tyndale. And Master Tyndale, hearing this, full of godly zeal and not bearing that blasphemous saying, replied and said, "I defy the Pope and all his laws," and further added that if God spared him, he would cause the boy that drives the plough to know more of Scripture than he did. So Tyndale offered to translate and was turned down. He then went abroad and began sending the copies of his Bible, copies of the Old Testament first, and then of the New Testament, from the Netherlands into England. These were seized when they arrived in England and burnt by Bishop Tunstall of London, which was all right for Tyndale because he got the money, and it prevented them coming in. But I want to show why Tyndale's translation was important. And I choose 3 words with Thomas More in his reply to the translation, A Dialogue Concerning Heresies, fastened upon priest, church, and charity. Tyndale used those 3 words in his Bible, and all these words are hallowed by ecclesiastical tradition, through which they've acquired their own special qualities. And it was precisely this that Tyndale wished to avoid, for he was setting out to destroy the accepted church structure. So, priest, presbyteros. Tyndale chose elder, which has no association with the Mass and the priesthood at all. For the Mass, there is nothing without a priest at all. Pointing out that the word has nothing to do with the Mass, More relates it to the English word alderman, presbyteros and alderman, elderman, simply a senior of some experience. For the Greek ecclesia, which is church, Tyndale chooses congregation, and that is anything More points out that it's common to a company of Christian men or to a company of Turks, so not necessarily associated with the church. And then the 3rd word, which is love, agape. Tyndale translates love, but loses the special sense of agape in the New Testament. So when Tyndale's translation came out, Thomas More attacked it in the dialogue concerning heresies. And Tyndale, by hook or by crook, was arrested and imprisoned in the Netherlands. There's Thomas More and his family, big family. Thomas More in the middle. On his right is his father. And look, they're all carrying books, a very bookish family. Margaret Roper just in front. But there is Tyndale. He was arrested in the Netherlands and imprisoned. And he wrote to the prison governor, "I suffer greatly from the cold in the head and am afflicted with perpetual catarrh. I ask to have a lamp in the evening. It's indeed wearisome," he says, "sitting alone in the dark. Most of all I beg and beseech your clemency to urge the commissariat that he will kindly permit me to have the Hebrew Bible in prison, the Hebrew grammar and the Hebrew dictionary, that I may pass the time in that study." But he wasn't allowed to, and he was garroted. You can see he's about to be garroted there, with the cord round his neck and burnt at the stake. So he died for the sake of the translation of the Bible. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go straight on to the last. I said I was going to talk about Augustine and Jerome, about Tyndale, about William Wycliffe, John Wycliffe, and then Tyndale. And lastly, I would say myself. I was told by my first teacher of the Bible that you can't understand the Bible until you smelled camel dung. I would say you can't understand the Bible until you've smelled camel dung and been lost in the desert. And here is the desert of Judea, and it's a very frightening place. Nothing grows. That's what the definition of a desert is. And when I asked the shepherd boy what the donkeys were eating, they said, "The donkey, he eats the ground. There's nothing there." And I used to take students to the Holy Land, and the trip was not complete until we went into the desert. And the last time I went, we went out to see there into the Judean desert. It's quite tricky. I wouldn't advise it. It's an Israeli army artillery shooting range, and that's the Judean desert. But my friend there, Otmar Kael, is standing in the ruins of a castle where King Herod buried the two sons he killed because he suspected them of trying to supplant him. Well, we went out and visited that. And as we came back, I heard someone shouting, "Stop!" Of course, being a good British explorer, I didn't stop. And then a stone flew past my nose, and I stopped. And there were two people, one whom we called Habakkuk, a great, huge man, wearing just a pair of jeans, not a shirt nor shoes, and an extra called the Red Devil, because he was wearing a red t-shirt, who stood over us, grasping a rock, ready to throw. And Habakkuk said, "Sit down on the path there, put down your packs, and don't look round." And the Red Devil stood above us, 6 of us. And Habakkuk purloined everything. He took cameras, radios, watches. He wouldn't take my watch because it was too cheap. Passports, and I had spares back at home. And everything of any value at all. And then said, "You can go now." And that was the end of that. So that was the danger of translating the Bible, getting to know that being lost in the desert. It's not quite the end of the story. Afterwards, I had, of course, to register it with the police for the insurance, and went into the headquarters of the police. Just on the left of those two people gesticulating is the police headquarters, and that's just next to the two, you can see two towers just above me on the left. Those the two, that is the reconstruction of Jerusalem, and the two towers are the reconstruction of Herod's palace, which is also Pontius Pilate's lodging when he came to Jerusalem. Behind the two men standing there is the high priest's palace. The high priest's palace is just this side. You can see a large courtyard area, open area with columns on either side. That is the high priest's palace. Well, I had to go into the high priest's palace to register the theft of all our appurtenances. And so it was worth it in the end. It was worth being hijacked by the bandits in order to get into the high priest's palace. So that's the sort of thing that happens once you start translating the Bible, and that's what I wanted to say. The Bible brings fire to the earth, but fire in several different ways, and it can be a disastrous fire, it can be a mere inconvenience, but that's part of my experience of translating the Bible. So thank you very much.